Welcome to Around the Empire. This is a Swapcast with Kyle Anzalone of the Conflicts of Interest podcast. And I'm Joanne Leon, the host of the Around the Empire podcast. Around the Empire is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Also, watch for some new platforms where we'll be expanding in the near future. Today we discuss the 2020 election and a new Time magazine article titled "The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election," unquote, which explains how a quote-unquote elite cabal, quote-unquote, saved democracy by, quote, influencing perceptions, changing rules and laws, steering media campaigns, and controlling the flow of information, unquote. Now, these actions, they're not illegal, but they affirm the feeling that many Americans have that something was wrong with the 2020 election. We also argue that the article is even more nefarious than it appears. The bold and likely exaggerated claims about the cabal's influence are reported as unquestionably heroic. Meanwhile, any effort by Trump and his supporters to question or challenge this shadow campaign is treated as an evil attack on democracy. The message is that Americans need our elites to craft the appropriate narrative so Americans consume the right information and vote for the right candidate. We recorded this on February 6th, 2021.
Hey Joanne, how's it going?
Hey Kyle, thanks for having me back on the show, these Swapcasts. Lots of fun.
Well, yeah, and I think we have a great topic today. Me and you are both fired up over this, and so
Yes.
hopefully we'll recapture some of that John Brennan hatred energy we had on those Russiagate shows. We had this article here from Time magazine that we're starting off with that is really incredible. I think if somebody is, the phrase blue pilled Joanne, or, somebody who has a very mainstream establishment view of things, is going to have to read this article 2 or 3 times to really understand what it's saying, because it's quite incredible. The article here is titled The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. And I'm just going to start off reading the first few paragraphs here that I think are very telling. A weird thing happened right after the November 3rd election. Nothing. The nation was braced for chaos. Liberal groups had vowed to take to the streets, planning hundreds of protests across the country. Right-wing militias were grinding for battle. In a poll before Election Day, 75% of Americans voiced concern about violence. Instead, an eerie quiet descended as Trump refused to concede. The response was not mass action, but crickets. When media organizations called the race for Joe Biden on November 7th, jubilation broke out as people thronged across cities to celebrate the process that resulted in Trump's ouster. So, the first, kind of part of that, Joanne, I thought was telling. For every prediction the past 4 years about we're going to have all this right-wing violence, this is really the only thing that's happened is at the Capitol, and we'll talk a lot about that today. But all these predictions about all this right wing violence, it's very interesting that they don't take a second thought and say like, oh hey, like those people weren't violent then. That's interesting.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure how to interpret that. Unless it was, if you remember the transition integrity thing, they had different scenarios. So I guess if for some reason they were not successful in doing what they were planning, I don't know. I guess they really just didn't know what to predict, and they exaggerate constantly the actions of Trump supporters, like for the past 4 years. So right. I don't know. They've got it in their head that they're just these. That they're going to come out with all their guns.
Yeah, and here's where we get into I think the real highlights of the article, Joanne, and what's been floating around, especially in memes on the internet. A second odd thing happened amid Trump's attempt to reverse the result. Corporate America turned on him. Hundreds of business leaders, many of whom had backed Trump's candidacy and supported his policies, called on him to concede to the president. Something felt amiss. It was all very, very strange, Trump said on December 2nd. Within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. In a way, Trump was right. And I just want to clarify for the YouTube censors that is the Time magazine saying that Trump was
Time
right.
magazine.
That, not me.
I'm a witness. I read it too. In a way, Trump was right. Quotes. That's in quotes.
Right. There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protests and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. The pact was formalized in a terse, little-noticed joint statement of both the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and AFL-CIO published on Election Day. Both sides would come to see it as an implicit bargain inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive racial justice protests, in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. The handshake between business and labor was just one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort directed not to winning the vote, but ensuring that it would be free and fair, credible, and uncorrupted. For more than a year, a loosely organized coalition of operatives scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attack from a remorseless pandemic and an autocratic inclined president. Though much of this activity took place on the left, there was a separate from the Biden campaign and cross ideological lines, with the crucial contributions by nonpartisan and conservative actors. The shadow campaigners were departed to stop Trump's victory. It was an election that no result could be discerned at all, a failure of the central act of democratic self-government that had been the hallmark of America since its founding. Their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting system and laws to help secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, recruited armies of poll workers, and got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time. They successfully pressured social media companies to take a harder line against disinformation and use data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped Americans understand how the vote would unfold over days or weeks, preventing Trump's conspiracy theories and false claims of victory from getting more traction. After Election Day, they mounted every pressure point to ensure that Trump could not overturn the results. The untold story of the election is thousands of people, both parties, who accomplished the triumph of American democracy at its very foundation, said Norm Eisen, a prominent lawyer and former Obama administration official who recruited Republicans and Democrats to the board of the Voter Protection Program. For Trump and his allies running their own campaign to spoil the election, the president spent months insisting that mail-in votes were a Democrat plot that would be rigged. His henchmen at the state level sought to bat their use. His lawyers brought dozens of superfluous lawsuits to make it more difficult to vote, and insurrection of the GOP legacy suppressive tactics before the election. Trump plotted to block the legitimate vote count, and he spent months following the November 3rd election trying to steal the election he lost, with lawsuits and conspiracy theories pressured on state and local officials, and finally surmounting his army of supporters in a January 6th rally that ended in violence at the Capitol. The democracy campaigners watched with alarm. Every week we felt we were in a struggle to pull off the election without the country going through a real dangerous moment unraveling, says former GOP Representative Zach Wamp, a Trump supporter who helped coordinate a bipartisan election protection council. We can look back and say this thing went pretty well, but not that case was not all clear in September and October that was going to be the case. This is the inside story of the conspiracy to save the 2020 election. Based on access to the group's inner workings, never before seen documents, and interviews with dozens of those involved across the political spectrum, is the story of an unprecedented, creative, and determined campaign whose success also reveals how close the nation came to disaster. Every attempt to interfere with the proper outcome of the election was defeated, says Ian Basson, co-founder of Protect Democracy, a non-Protestant rule of law advocacy group. But it's massively important for the country to understand that it didn't happen accidentally. The system didn't work magically. Democracy is not executing. That's why participants went into the secret history of the 2020 election to be told. Even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream, a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. They were not rigging the election, they were fortifying it. And they believe the public needs to understand the system's fragility in order to ensure democracy in America endures. And again, that last paragraph is me quoting Times Magazine, not me, saying that I believe that is fact, just so I don't get censored here. So, Joanne, that's quite amazing, right? They are saying that, for a lot of people who felt like the election was rigged, and there were people who said secret ballots and stuff like that. That's not necessarily what they were talking about here, but there were a lot of people who felt like there was a coordinated effort by the media, social media companies, the way rules and laws were changed, that changed the way the election would have gone had the vote occurred as it did in 2016 by the same rules, laws, and kind of media wavering. And here they are saying that is true, and it's flabbergasting how they put down and attack the people who believe that there was something wrong with this election, and then outright say that yes, there was a secret cabal that was trying to meddle here to influence how the election went.
Yeah. I just want to note all the loaded language.
Right.
In this article, all the basic assumptions not questioned that I personally don't agree with. But what you're talking about is more of the psychological aspect of this. And we talked about this a little bit offline, where I looked at this and I was like, whoa, Kyle, this is gaslighting. That's exactly what this is. So that's part of it. But the other thing that I had mentioned to Kyle too is that I have two examples now of when the superiority and the elitist attitude just is all throughout this. And I think it's what causes them, what motivates them. They have to brag. I mean, how could you not brag about something like this? And they can't not do that. And we saw that after the Obama election, it was like a solid year. I would say that, and I guess I was an MSNBC viewer back then too, so that would have been skewed. But they just couldn't stop talking about the brilliance of this, the use of technology and social media, and the various figures who were this sort of team of superheroes who, handled the campaign and the election. And they just couldn't stop. And they really did it for all 4 years, those first terms. Not so much the second, because, they weren't doing well at all going into the 2020 election, regardless of the outcome. But I also remember, and I'm going to look into this a little further, I've been meaning to for a long time. In the 90s, Yeltsin was our guy. right? This is the Harvard boys do Russia is the name of one of the articles. Some people still kind of told a little more truth than they do now, but they also could not resist bragging. And they did I think there was a book and a movie about, I should have the name, but I don't. It's something Spinning Boris, I think it's what it's called. And basically they admit to the fact that they just hijacked the whole election. This was a man who had, I think, first of all, Boris Yeltsin was an extreme alcoholic, non-functioning alcoholic, extremely corrupt. But, lots of people used his position of power to enrich themselves, including his family and people in the Western world. But his approval rating was something, I don't know, single digits. The country was in terrible crisis. Bread lines, the death rate was spiraling. It was awful.
Yeah, for my libertarian friends, a shocking fact is that after the collapse of communism in the USSR, living standards got worse in Russia, right? So you imagine after 50 years of communism, how could the economy get any worse? And it did.
It did, actually. I don't know if you could call that straight up communism. I don't even know what their system was, authoritarian socialism or whatever. But anyway, yeah.
State control the economy,
Central planning.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, so, but they took over, the media. They propped the guy up and rigged where they could, and they employed, Hollywood, this kind of thing, and they probably stole that election, or they manipulated it so much that they got him back in office. And they continue to prop him up for, another however many years it was until Putin came in 2000, I think it was.
Yeah, I think it was around New Year's Day.
But instead of keeping that secret among themselves, particularly now it's even more comical now. When I say comical,
in a very dark way.
Everything I laugh at is a gallows humor. Yeah. So, but they had to brag about it. They had to make movies about it. And that's, I think, part of what we're seeing here. But also, they're desperate to frame it. Because I guess you can't keep something this big secret for that long, right? But the framing was really important all throughout the article.
I disagree. I think they could have, because this subject is so toxic that I would not, if this had come out from another outlet, I don't know if I would have talked about it on the show, just because I felt it was something that I think could get the show taken off of YouTube and stuff. I feel like, time running the article has to give me cover on that, kind of angle. But if this was like, say, something that like Fox News published, I mean, I would look at it, critically and everything. But if I felt like it checked out, like, this is them bragging. This isn't an expose in any way. As you say, the language is very, slighted against Trump whenever, it comes to something he's doing. Him and his minions are scheming, where anybody else, it would be, well, this was their plan. They call his, people henchmen. Tell me who you're talking about. Are you talking about really Giuliani, Lin Wood? Who are you talking about here? Use names. Come on, you're not a child. But that's the kind of thing in this article. The other thing I thought was so telling, Joanne, is that they portrayed this as it was defending democracy. But do you think there is any way this article would have been written if Trump had gotten more votes on election day and had won the election?
No.
Even though I think they would say that that's their cover. I think they would say, well, this was like a bipartisan group and it was about defending democracy and wasn't about picking Joe Biden as president. But I mean, there's no way they would have called it defending democracy and written this article otherwise.
Yeah. And what does bipartisan mean now? It means establishment. And what is the Biden, whatever, allies? They're Republican and Democrat establishment, neoliberals and neoconservatives. And we've been saying that all along. They hardly even tried to hide that. And it was also there, I maybe expanded between 2016 to 2020, I don't know, but it was they had the never Trumpers. So if you could call that bipartisan, I
Right.
guess,
Well,
whatever.
I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the Lincoln Project is far more influential over the Biden administration than, like, say, Black Lives Matter. I think, and that they're far closer in policy to a John Kasich than maybe Bernie Sanders, but certainly like anybody further to the left. You know, the more Black Lives Matter people. That's the Biden administration is very centrist.
And you have to also take note of how many times they employed the label progressive in here. They
Right.
said all these people were progressives. That's just a cover. That's literally just a cover. They're not progressives. I can't even tell you what a progressive is. It was always a little bit of a squishy term. Modern day progressives. The previous progressives were a little bit better defined, and not like modern progressives, or not a lot like. But even Hillary Clinton was forced to use the progressive label, but like she got practically choked on it when they're saying, "Are you progressive?" I'm progressive that gets things done. And you could see the distaste in it, just getting that word out of her mouth because they hate real progressives so much. But that term is lost. I mean, it's a goner. So anybody who's tempted to use that to describe a certain group of people, you really do just have to get a new label. And they'll co-opt that too. They'll try to co-opt that. Maybe you should pick some really awful label. I don't know. Yeah, so, but that's the cover. These are not
Yeah.
progressives, unless they were well-paid ones, which is very possible. And that's another subject. I don't have solid evidence. So, but there was a lot of money flowing. You think any of this, how'd this get funded,
Right. They
Kyle?
say.
This is 37 states,
Right. They
all
said
directed
they
from DC.
thought they need in this article they say they thought they needed 2 billion. Congress allocated 400 million in the CARES Act, and then the only other funding they identify was the $300 million lump sum from the Chan Zuckerberg group. So I would assume that's Zuckerberg and his wife, I think. So that's social media, big tech, being right down in this. Joy, I did want to just quickly offer what I think is why they would write this article, because I think a lot of people would be, why would they do this, right? Like, like they could all sit in their back rooms smoking their cigars and enjoy themselves, but I guarantee you this Mike Podhorzer, who's celebrated in this article. There's a couple other people who are really built up as some of the main people behind this.
One of them I want to mention later too when we're done.
Okay. And yeah, they I think they said what Move On was involved, Greenpeace. They have tons of different groups involved here and stuff like that. But how many emails do you think this guy has gotten in the past, 48 hours of people saying, thank you for saving the country. We almost lost it to Hitler. We're in so much trouble. And you came through and made sure the right thing happened and saved our democracy. And I'm sure that I've heard Matt Taibbi make this point a lot. Like that's kind of they're so like kind of in their cultural bubble, and so that is kind of my thinking on why that they gave this they wrote this piece. And of course they knew that Time Magazine was going to portray it in a very positive light, even though what went on here sounds extremely slimy. When you say it that nicely, a lot of people are just like, oh, I guess that is okay.
I don't know. That was one of the things I questioned, that despite their jumping through hoops to frame this a particular way, I mean, don't they realize how some people are going to see this? But there's a woman named Laura Quinn. I think it's Laura Quinn. I don't have a good search function on here. But they give her the kudos. They give her the credit for doing the censorship, the disinformation defense. And, here we go. Bad actors spreading false information is nothing new. For decades, campaigns have grappled with everything from anonymous calls claiming the election had been rescheduled to flyers spreading nasty smears about blah, blah, blah. Trump's lies and conspiracy theories, the viral force of social media, and the involvement of foreign meddlers made disinformation a broader, deeper threat to the 2020 vote. Laura Quinn, a veteran progressive operative who co-founded Catalyst, began studying the problem a few years ago. She piloted a nameless secret project, which she has never before publicly discussed, that tracked disinformation online and tried to figure out how to combat it. One component was tracking dangerous lies that might otherwise spread unnoticed. Researchers then provided information to campaigners or the media to track down the sources and expose them, or the media. The most important takeaway from Quinn's research, however, was that engaging with toxic content only made it worse. Quote, when you get attacked, the instinct is to push back, call it out, and say, this isn't true, Quinn says, quote, but the more engagement something gets, the more platforms boost it. The algorithm reads that as, oh, this is popular, people want more of it. The solution, she concluded, was to pressure platforms to enforce their rules, both by removing content or accounts that spread disinformation by more aggressively policing it in the first place. Quote, the platforms have policies against certain types of malign behavior, but they haven't been enforcing them, she says. Quinn's research gave ammunition to advocates pushing social media platforms to take a harder line. In November 2019, Mark Zuckerberg invited blah, blah, blah. It goes on. But so if you ever wondered, like, who was taking you down, it was a project like this. One of the other things this article jokingly says, Kyle, again, I don't have a good search function, but they say our goal was never to choose who won the election. It was never to sway the election in one side or another. It was just to protect democracy itself, which is a total joke. They're all Democrats and Democratic operatives. And I mean, nobody, there can't be one person in this country who didn't notice that all this work was slanted in one way or the other. So basically, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to cut in and say, did you catch while we're on the social, like in the media campaign part, there's a part in this article where they mention specifically Fox News calling Arizona for Biden early, which was, you know,
As
a
if
big
it was
deal.
a surprise. They
And
said it was a surprise.
they said the public awareness in response to that, they said the public awareness campaign worked. TV anchors were urging their audiences to be careful, blah, blah, blah. But the response to Fox News calling Arizona for Biden early was that the campaign to, like, you know, have the TV networks in line worked. And that's a shocking statement, because that was something that a lot of people point out. And look, maybe Biden did win Arizona, but that election was contested for quite a while, and you know, calling it so early definitely seemed very suspicious. Also, it's a part of, I think, something that we had talked about either right before or right after the election, Joanne, was how important crafting the narrative of the election would be. And I had felt like that was even more important really than the vote total itself, in a way, because, you know, whoever the media said won and whoever, you know, they agreed all won. And in a way, that's been the case, because now anybody really isn't allowed to question that, you know, Joe Biden won the election. Now, you know, if this was 4 years ago, 2017, in February, you would be probably in the popular opinion, at least in one of the parties, to say, in the Democratic Party, to say that Donald Trump wasn't the rightful president. And now that's not allowed to be questioned. So I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to point that out. They also claimed that they were surprised that the media called Arizona, when to me it looked, I don't know. It was very clear to me that it was important to always, the electoral count that stayed up at the top of every media screen that whole night, was never in Trump's favor. I don't know about that very early period, but the states that they called, even the one that looked totally ridiculous, Virginia, for a while there, they would have these giant percentage differences, but they would refuse to call a state. And then as long as the state wasn't called, they didn't have to change the electoral vote total.
Right.
So anyway,
Right.
that's a little bit of a rehash, but
In where they're saying that they were surprised about that, they were saying that they were kind of surprised that their plan worked, not that that this happened out of nowhere and how could anybody have predicted it and how honest Fox News is. No, they felt like their influence campaign had worked. So, Joanne, what other kind of takeaways do you have from this article? Again, I think it reveals something that we often try to touch on, and that isn't just the story itself, but how the mainstream media crafts the narrative to really help expand the U.S. empire in almost all these cases.
yeah, I mean, I'm still so sort of stunned by this article that I'm not sure that I have all my takeaways together. But the way they end the article is democracy won in the end. The will of the people prevailed. But it's crazy in retrospect that this is what it took to put on an election in the United States of America. I think it's very clear what's coming next. And that could be another purpose of an article like this. And that is to their election reform is not going to be real reform. It's going to be election control. Because they do mention in here about how just what a massive effort it was. Why? Because we have 50 states and they have different, they have, nominally control of their elections and they can choose their own systems and such. And they admit that they influence 37 states on how to do things. I'm not even going to get into the pandemic part of it, but
Right.
The other thing is that going back to another point that we talked about earlier about the funding, they talk about how much funding it was. Well, that doesn't count the media airtime that is essentially ad money and things like that. That takes it into, almost a countless, a limitless budget. But they mentioned that it wasn't enough money, and they got it from the pandemic. They took from the pandemic fund.
It was they
Underfunded
legislated
people.
it in the CARES Act. They snuck it in the
Yeah.
CARES Act.
Yeah, which you know what kind of pressure was on.
Right.
And it,
Yeah, Thomas Massey was going to kill all Americans by actually having the Congress vote on that one. They were claiming. So,
oh yeah, when you go
yeah,
back in real time, it's like, but they what they call it is and it just wasn't enough money, so we had to go to philanthropic sources of money, and as you mentioned, they don't really say where all the money came from, and it triggered me. Funny word, triggered now cracks me up. But another article that my former podcast co-host used to did recently post on social media, and I gave you a link to maybe stick in the show notes. But it's on. I'm not familiar with this outlet called Spiked, but it's called. The title is Billionaire. Oh, now I just lost it. Sorry, hold on. The billionaire takeover of civil society. That's another one of those loaded, vague terms, but it really means a lot. But what this woman does, and I think she says she's Irish, from Ireland. Rosalind Fuller is her name. She just takes one sort of fund from Pierre Midyar, and she maps it out of all the different organizations that it almost reminds you of shell companies that are hidden into another. They end up funding each other, they promote each other, they refer to each other as experts, and it's not something that I could talk about in a short period of time, but I would recommend this article after that Time article to get an even better idea of the kinds of organizations who are operating in something like this. And if you do a cross-reference, I'm dead sure that some of the ones from the Time article or related ones are involved in what she looked at. But it's basically what it is billionaires behind it. It's an oligarchy. So all of these great democratic things are just about the most anti-democratic things in reality. So it's very important for them to frame this as saving the election as they talk about how it was an alliance between capital and labor. But we're talking about the Chamber of Commerce, and a lot of the Chamber of Commerce's members at that point would have been dying. These businesses were shut down. Also, the labor leaders have become more and more distant from the rank and file union members. Like, they don't really represent them. And if you want to look at this as success or failure, I mean, how many blue collar union workers do you think they flipped? Their own people? Probably not that many. So they talk about it as labor, but when they talk about labor, they're talking about high level labor leaders who do not represent or really speak for their rank and file. And unions have been so disintegrated in this country, I believe is less than 10% of workers are unionized now. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I just had a couple final things, Joanne. I just noticed that the like cover art for this article, for people watching the YouTube version of this, you could see it. They even go as far as to have like storm clouds and lightning bolts behind Donald Trump and his supporters, and like sunshine coming out from behind Biden's head. It's just crazy to the level you find that in this article.
Yeah.
There's one more thing I want to point out, which was they say that with the George Floyd protests, they created election defenses, and what these election defenders were, where they said they were trained in de-escalation tactics, and that they would go and stand around the polls during election day and early voting periods to keep the peace, and it turned voting into a party. And so I found that to be an interesting tactic. But can you imagine the stories that would have come out if Trump had rallied his supporters, if there were like Proud Boys standing at some of these, voting lines? They would call voter intimidation and all like that. And I didn't even know this was going on. So I thought that was a less interesting little bit from the actual article. There was just one overall takeaway I want to mention, Joanne, and that is how obvious it is that what they did right here is the exaggerated claim of what they said Russia did with Trump in 2016, and they claim that was stealing the election. And so now they openly admit to doing the exact same thing, but if anybody says the election was stolen, they're an idiot who needs to be censored from the planet. And as we will get into in these coming videos, labeled a domestic terrorist and be treated violently by the U.S. government. So that was some of my takeaways here.
A couple other quick things. After the 2016 election, the so-called left, and a lot of my friends, they were obsessed with the Trump's populist support and tactics. They were just trying to analyze every little thing, and they were totally freaking out about memes. And they did their best to shut down memes. And in this article, they admit that memes were, one of their key tools. But going along the lines of what you just said about how what they did here and admitted to is exactly what they accused Russia of doing. One of the operations that they mentioned, and I forget the person's name, but he's considered to be a guru of election data and apps and tech and all that stuff. The types of things they described look like to me exactly what they accused Cambridge Analytica of doing. And if you watch the documentary on Cambridge Analytica, they painted that whole thing as a really demon type thing. The whole mood of it was ridiculous. But what they're admitting to here sounds a whole lot like a Cambridge Analytica type thing. So it is. It just blows your mind. As I say sometimes, hypocrisy that word is not sufficient. We need a superlative. We need a much stronger word for hypocrisy and double standards and that kind of thing, because what's employed here, it's just, I would call it like almost psychopathic hypocrisy. It's so crazy.
No, it's very shocking that you could be on these sides of these issues. Anything else on this article, Joanne? And I mean, maybe we'll talk again in a little bit, and we'll have to bring this back up and continue to reflect on it as we go, because there's just so much in here where it's so obvious that. I don't know how this isn't taunting the right a little bit. You know what I mean? To have this so openly published. And man, I hope Donald Trump, his defense team just reads this over and over again at the impeachment. That's what I would do. But are you ready to get into these two video clips that we have lined up?
Yeah, sure.
All right, just to preview them real quick, we're going to run them back to back. The first one is Nicole Wallace at MSNBC, and then the second one is Joe Scarborough.
And that is a bulletin released to all law enforcement earlier this week that there is, until the end of April, a persistent threat of domestic extremism, domestic terrorism carried out in the ideology and around this belief that the election was fraudulent, that the COVID restrictions are unnecessary. All of those ideologies pushed by Donald Trump. But my question for you is around incitement. We had a policy, and it was very controversial. It was carried out under the Bush years and under the Obama years, of attacking terrorism at its root, of going after and killing, and in the case of Amr al-Awlaki, an American, a Yemeni American, with a drone strike for the crime of inciting violence, inciting terrorism. Mitch McConnell was in the Senate then. He was in the Senate after 9/11 too. How does Mitch McConnell, who understands that the way you root out terrorism is to take on, in the case of Islamic terrorism, kill those who incite it, how does he not vote to convict someone that he said on the floor of the Senate?
Just turn the page. Just said after 9/11. You know what? Let's just pretend it's going to go away. Let's just forget about it. 9/11. Would Ron Johnson say, let's just forget about it? Yeah, they attacked the Pentagon. Yeah, they attacked. Let's just forget about it. That's what Lindsay wants us to do. He wants us to forget about the fact that people were bludgeoned in the... You know what? I said we needed to call them Islamic terrorists. You know why? Because they were Islamic terrorists. You know what these people are? These are Trump terrorists. Call them by their name. Reverend Al, can I get a witness?
You'd certainly have a witness, I think.
So I did, skip the beginning and the end of the Scarborough video just because he's yelling the whole time and he's all worked up the whole time. But I think I got some of the great facial expressions and his antics there. But Joanne, what do you think of these videos and kind of the state of the media, especially over apparently at MSNBC, where they're, saying that we need that. Apparently they actually do believe that the what happened in the SITs was 9/11. And we need to respond in the same way we would respond to, if it was Osama bin Laden, Trump bin Laden.
Yeah, and around the same time, I don't have the article in front of me, but is it a former counterterrorism chief at the CIA said that some of the tactics against the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan should be employed here at home.
Right, and John Brennan also mentioned, the FBI was going after, with laser light focus, the Trumpers, the racists, and the libertarians. So,
and Joe Biden apparently said, I didn't see this myself, but I heard about it. But after the two FBI were killed in Florida, apparently he made a comment that said, well, some of the FBI, most of the FBI are good, but
I don't know if it was
weird.
Biden or his press secretary or something, but they did kind of hint at there were bad people in the FBI. And so, the American religion of, you had to worship the military and law enforcement, that triggered some people definitely.
Well, it wasn't so much what they said, it was the timing of when they said it, almost implying that maybe these two deserved to be. I don't know. It was just strange timing for that. I mean, Trump used to say it all the time because there clearly was some kind of an internal pull there in the FBI, and presumably they have the opposite enemies. But yeah, so just we used to, I mean, lots of people have suggested that war tactics always end up coming home. And we've seen it before. And some people have just constantly worried about drone strikes on individuals just based on like a cell phone number and someone's targeting through no due process is an extremely scary thing. But ever since the Al-Awlaki thing, like that hasn't really been a big topic. And I don't know if any of us, I just speak for myself, but that was just a step. I didn't think they'd ever be able to do that, actually drone people on American soil. But now they're not just talking about like going after a serial killer or something. They're talking about targeting a group of people. Mm-hmm. And it's just pretty shocking. And if they're printing something in the media with that guy recommending it, and you have, John Brennan making these statements too, although he's supposedly not part of government anymore. But it seems there's constant talk about domestic terrorism. There was an entire press conference 2 days ago. Jen Psaki, or whatever her name is, and it was just about how determined Biden is to implement some new domestic terrorist laws. And someone in one of the media figures asked her, well, what is your definition of domestic terrorism? Because, we had this vague definition of terrorism ever since the war on terror started. And she dodged the question. So the definition of a domestic terrorist is going to be squishy.
Very, very. That's the concern, right? Is that I don't think in the first round of terrorists, Joanne, me and you will, I don't think we're going to be lumped into there. I think, they're going to be looking at maybe like environmental people on the left or something like that, but particularly maybe like 3%ers and right-wing militia types. However, once the Biden administration is ready to go to war, what they call the greatest threat of terror, Iran, and the greatest state sponsor of terror, and me and you are saying Iran's not trying to make a nuclear bomb, they're not a state sponsor of terror, or if it's Assad or whoever, that's where I worry about the label starting to get extended more and more. And I hope the American government is smart enough not to carry out a drone strike on American soil. I imagine that would be, I don't know, Stanley McChrystal's Insurgent Math, you kill one, you end up with 20. That's you kill one, you end up with 4 million. I'm not even, like, a drone strike on American soil I think would be too much for the militia types in the U.S., and that would be a clear breaching of the line. However, I think people ending up on no-fly list or different surveillance lists is definitely a possibility. The sneak and peek raids, going on. The general.
Well, can I just mention?
Yeah, go ahead.
Interject. Digital currency. Mm-hmm. I believe it was somebody from the Davos group talking about how a digital currency tied into a lot of other things can be used as you can sanction individuals, cut off their money.
Yeah. Using like a Fed-based digital currency to cut people off. There was a a Twitter person, a famous Russiagator that we both don't like, and Miss Marcy was suggesting that maybe these people should be unbanked. She said, "I'm not saying this," but then she suggested it twice. So obviously that's what she's saying. Those kind of things are possibilities. And just the government has a lot of power with like the 2012 NDAA for indefinite detention, and with a loose enough definition, domestic terrorist. I mean, this could turn into a very, very police light state very quickly here.
And you have someone like Joe Scarborough, to me, exhibiting extremist behavior himself,
right?
And just screaming, "They're terrorists! They're terrorists!" I was actually watching C-SPAN that day. I think I was talking with you and some other people at the time. The footage from right up on the steps there was not available, but the people on the lawn, not too far away, were there. They were mostly just regular people and pretty peaceful. There were some families. So it really looks silly. And I always wish I captured a clip from CNN that day, because they had this footage coming in of the people on the lawn area. And this is where actually some of my some independent media people who we talked to were there and had footage of like the same thing that I saw on the live feed. But they were the language that Anderson Cooper and some people on CNN were using was like, "Look at this, look at the threat they have, look at this is terrible," and all this stuff. And then while they're saying these things, reading their lines, they have people waving American flags and like
right.
Some of them with kids, and you're like, "Oh, somebody really messed up here. You got the wrong footage."
Or they're showing like the Chamber of Commerce, or not the Chamber of Commerce, the I think Senate chamber that day, and they're saying that like there's a riot and insurrection going on, and they had the C-SPAN was still showing the thing, and they were still in there like milling around and chatting. I mean, it certainly wasn't like there was a coup outside. You know what I mean? So that was
one of the first things I told you that day. I said they stayed within the rope lines.
Right. Yep.
They didn't even knock them over.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even a couple of years ago when they were like cheering on in Hong Kong, them like vandalizing the building and stuff, they ripped up the protesters there, ripped up the paintings and stuff. They didn't do any of that. And there you see footage of when they're like in the Senate chambers. There's like certain protesters that are rioters or whatever the hell you want to call them. They're like telling other people like, "Hey, don't mess with this. This is sacred." Whatever. Not that I'm a big fan of that kind of stuff anyways, but these aren't necessarily riotous behaviors. Can we get into this Brian Sitnett story real quick?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because Scarborough did mention that it was a deadly and
I think he mentions that they beat a police officer to death a couple times in there.
He did, yeah.
And now, if people will remember on my show, after this whole Capitol insurrection thing happened, I said that I was skeptical about this police officer's death. Not that he didn't die or anything, but that the story had changed several times during the first day, from that he was beat to death with a fire extinguisher to it switched over, I think, then to he was in a coma, to he had a medical emergency, and then he was in an altercation with protesters and died. People are pushing this narrative that it was a fireman that threw a fire extinguisher and that he beat him to death. That turned out not to be true, which is interesting that, I'm sure that guy ended up with like plenty of death threats out of all of this. And I don't want to make him out to be too much of a victim or anything. But at the same time, it wasn't true that he killed a police officer, and that's, what people on Twitter were saying and what was suggested. He's been charged with 3 accounts of assault because he did throw an empty fire extinguisher, which, if anybody's carried an empty one, it's a hell of a lot lighter than a full one. And I guess it hit 3 police officers, so that's he
quite a throw. Underhanded too. I mean,
okay.
Don't, but but there is some footage of that.
Right. I'm not trying to downplay it too much, but at the same time, he was charged with three counts of assault, and but he clearly didn't murder anybody. And so then they still, for weeks, everybody has been saying they beat somebody to death with either an American flag or a fire extinguisher, and that's how terrible this thing is. Now we had this article from CNN detailing how the feds are having trouble building a murder case of Brian Sitnick because authorities, this is from CNN, authorities have reviewed the photographs that show Brian Sitnick engaged with rioters amid the siege, but yet to identify a moment in which he suffered his fatal injuries. Soon after Sitnick died on January 7th, prosecutors opened a federal murder investigation, detaining the team inside the U.S. Attorney's Office to the case. There's not a whole lot of information yet. I just looked. We're recording this on Saturday the 6th. The autopsy report has not been released, but a source from the police department talking to CNN. So again, I don't think CNN is reporting rumors that are downplaying the Capitol thing. They're saying that they don't think it was a physical injury. They don't have any results from the autopsy showing traumatic injury. And so now they're looking at things like maybe he was maced or hit with pepper spray. But we've seen from those videos, Joanne, looks like the police are using the pepper spray pretty liberally. I know the protesters were as well, but this is pretty notable that maybe Brian Sitnick wasn't killed by the protesters.
And he went back to the precinct under his own power, right? And it wasn't until after he went back that he needed medical attention, which, that doesn't say, that's not definitive, but I think it's just a very relevant fact.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention on that was they say maybe he was hit with bear mace and that could have been what killed him, which I could imagine that's the kind of thing that could, especially if he had some kind of lung issue, kill him. And, that's certainly deserving of some kind of probably murder charge if somebody, sprayed bear mace in his face. But at the same time, I think if he was hit with bear mace, he probably would have gotten medical attention at some point.
I would think he'd be doubled over. I would think he would have needed help getting back.
Right. If he was pepper sprayed by somebody, whether it was, a protester, rioter, insurrectionist, whatever the hell you want to call him, or if he got that from the own police, that's also notable. But I think they're going to have a hard time charging that as a homicide anyways, just because if you mace somebody, I don't think you're intending to kill them. Also, there's been a few people that have been maced by police during the BLM protest, and they never charged those cops with murder. And so I think the cops would see it as a dangerous precedent to start, charging people with murder or attempted murder for inappropriate macings, because the cops are I think the most frequent violators of that.
Yeah, and there are the infamous incidents from Occupy Wall Street, which I was pretty close to at the time. The one from Berkeley where the cop just goes up and down. The students are just sitting there,
right?
Like interlocked arms or something, and he just goes around shooting just spraying it in their faces. And of course that went sort of viral.
Right. But
also the one of the young women in New York City who got hit with pepper spray by those cops. I did witness some of those, not that incident, but I did witness the New York NYPD cops during Occupy Wall Street. And yeah.
And there were definitely times with Black Lives Matter protests where cops were just driving down a street and held a canister out the window and, sprayed everybody there. Are those all attempted murder charges? I mean, we talk about that, but I don't think they're going that route with the pepper spray if that was what killed him.
But none of that stops Joe Scarborough from screaming that
they
beat him to death. And that means that I know firsthand that some people, they believe there are certain points that they focus on and say over and over and over again. And we watch this all through Russiagate that are flat out false. But they are part of the accepted narrative, and they live on, and they're going to become part of the history books if we ever do have history books going forward. So
I don't know. Let's hope maybe me and you get to write those, Joanne, or something like that, because, here you have them taking a really extreme interpretation of what happened on the sits. Again, especially if Brian Sitnik didn't die. Also, to go back and try to like have the conversations that have occurred in the U.S. over the past month with the knowledge that that if he didn't die, then the deaths on the sits were Ashley Babbitt, who was shot in the neck by a police officer. There was a heart attack, a guy who shot himself in the groin and killed himself, and then somebody apparently trampled to death. And none of those things are indications of a ruthless, violent, insurrectionist coup plot to take over the country. And so this death, I think, was extremely critical to that narrative. And so if that's not there, because if you questioned what happened on the sits in the past month, they invoke a police officer was beaten to death. How can you have that interpretation?
by Trump terrorists.
By Trump's terrorists, right? And so I think they're may have trouble with that narrative. That's not the case. So, and again, I'm not trying to like suggest any kind of conspiracy here. Like, I don't know. I know people get carried away with this or anything. I'm just saying that the narrative that they initially brought up and what they've been using to push the terrorist label and suggest a domestic war on terror and drone strikes and these new laws is not correct. And they're not bothering really to correct it or change it. So,
it sounds like an agenda.
Joanne, do you want me to ask you about these smart cities real quick?
I don't know if we're going to have enough time to go into it much, but I definitely want to bring it up.
Yeah, why don't you tell my audience? I've never talked about a smart city on the show, so talk about what a smart city is, and then I have this article here from AP on February 3rd. Nevada bill would allow tech companies to create governments.
Yeah, smart cities. The person who's done the best work on that is Whitney Webb. And basically they are rebuilt, heavily surveilled, like really heavily surveilled, and Internet of Things type cities. And it is one of the goals of the Great Reset. So there's that. And then this article comes out. Initially, the article came out in the name of it. It's like the Las Vegas, hold on, I have the name of it. The Las Vegas Review Journal. And then this AP article is drawn. Because there's a piece of legislation out there, and the governor, a Democrat of Nevada, in his State of the State address, pushed this idea. So the governor put it in his State of the State address, and there's some draft legislation out there. It could change, but it's written. So the title of the article is Nevada Bill Would Allow Tech Companies to Create Governments. And I thought, oh, that must be sensational. It's not. The proposal is to establish new business areas in Nevada that would allow technology companies to form a separate local government. And they're going to call them innovation zones. And it would give companies who have a big piece of land, and there are, statistics on how big the land has to be, to form governments that carry the same authority as a county. And they would impose their own taxes. They would have their own school districts. They'd have their own courts, and they would do government services. So they're not privatized. They're actually going to form a little alternative type government. And it would be run by a board, and the board would be. In this article, it says that the companies would have a big say in who that overseeing board would be, which means they would choose them. So another part of it is that the companies had, in the beginning of this anyway, they have to be certain kinds of really high-tech companies. But what they mention is that they have to be the company behind this initially is a cryptocurrency company owned by a lawyer. Let me get you some of the information about that.
Is it Blockchain LLC?
Yeah, here it is. In 2018, Blockchains, plural, LLC, the tech firm owned by a lawyer and cryptocurrency millionaire Jeffrey Burns, purchased roughly 67,000 acres, about the same size as the city of Henderson, of undeveloped, uninhabited land in Story County at the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center for $170 million. So that, that's going to be I guess that seems to be one of the driving forces behind it. But they're saying that not just any company can do this. They have to be, I'm trying to find here we go. So the governor's Office of Economic Development would oversee the application. So if you buy the land and you get approved by this governor's executive office application board, that approves the application, it would be limited to companies working in specific business areas, including blockchain, autonomous technology, so AI, the Internet of Things, robotics, artificial intelligence, wireless, biometrics, and renewable resource technology. So you have to be in that business to be able to do this. And in another part of the article, they mention that Blockchains is a company that had committed to developing a smart city in an area east of Reno after the legislation has passed. And the reason why they want to do this, why they would allow such a thing, is they say that through traditional local government models, it is inadequate. The model is inadequate alone to provide the resources to make Nevada a leader in attracting and retaining businesses and fostering economic development in emerging technologies and industries. So, instead of doing things like they've done with economic zones and whatever they've called them, where they usually end up with some money from the government, they're just gonna. It's kind of more like it would remind me of the Indian tribal areas that have some autonomy, and so there's been some pushback. But this guy who owns Blockchains has been doing a lot of political donations on both sides of the aisle for a number of years. There are some others, particularly in the adjacent county that this land is actually part of. It would become adjacent. They're not happy about it because, of course, anyway,
right.
It's going to draw, I would think, maybe businesses into it. I don't really know. I don't know what to make of it, but it also kind of looks like maybe implementing smart cities would be difficult to do with local governments, and you're going to have to displace people. And so they're just taking an supposedly uninhabited area, and they're just going to create this thing completely outside. I think it's shocking. You can buy a little state or a little county for yourself if you have enough money and enough influence in this government. Where's that going to go?
I guess in a way, Joanne, that doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world to me. That
if
a bunch of people want to start a little community. But let me tell you why I don't like this plan at all. Is because you have to go to the government and you gotta get your approval for land, and so that means that it's only going to be people who spend all their time sucking up to politicians, making all these corrupt donations, that are able to get there. And then my other issue is that, especially in Nevada, a huge amount of the land kind of state-owned and national-owned. And so it's not like they're going to let a bunch of, regular people who maybe want to live in like their own community with, their own maybe little law set or something. Maybe they want more freedom. Maybe they want less, maybe they want to be like super strict religious conservative types, or maybe they want to be ultra liberals and, want to be able to walk around topless all day or something like that in their little county. That's not what's going to come out of this. It's going to be, I think, like kind of technocratic little states and little fiefdoms where people who are well connected to the state are able to carve out their little territory where they're probably able to better exploit the people who live there.
Nevada, especially being that it's Nevada, I don't know, to me, is it going to end up being the ultimate gated community for, again, for the billionaires? Like Bill Gates is trying to do something similar in Phoenix, next to Phoenix. I don't have that article in front of me, but I know here is affirm. I got it. This is CNBC. A firm tied to Bill Gates invested $80 million in an Arizona smart city. Belmont, near Phoenix, is slated to be designed around technology. Cascade Investment reportedly bought an $80 million stake in the development. The Arizona Republic discovered the connection to Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates through property records. A firm tied to Bill Gates involved $80 million investment, smart city in Arizona, according to property records, yet to be developed. Community on the west side of Phoenix would have a freeway running to Reno, Nevada, and would be developed around solar power, electric distribution systems, autonomous auto testing, broadband, and data centers. I don't know. I can't. There's a lot of drug and gun running and trafficking of every imaginable thing in that area too. I can't help but thinking some of the other things it might be used for, and they don't mention the banks, but
right. All right, Joanne. Well, we'll have to keep an eye on the smart city stuff, and maybe we can have a deeper discussion about it, because I'm sure there's some like fundamental principle kind of things that me and you could get into that we have differences on that would be pretty interesting. But again, this looks like, kind of something that come out of a very corrupt state, not something that is a peace-loving, freedom-loving people like kind of doing their own thing and being more free and peaceful because of it.
Well, I would say smart cities, the best way to describe them through a metaphor is that movie Minority Report. That's what it would remind you of.
All right. Well, Joanne, I thanks so much for sitting down and doing another one, the Swapcast. You're aroundtheempire.com, Around the Empire on YouTube. I'm Conflicts of Interest on YouTube, and then the Libertarian Institute is where you find all my work, libertarianinstitute.org. Please support both of mine and Joanne's shows financially if you can. I got Subscribestar up and running, verified, so now if you want to donate to Conflicts of Interest on Subscribestar, you can. Joanne, are you on Subscribestar yet?
I'm not there yet, but I'm expanding to some other platforms for all things, for support and for content.
For now, if somebody wanted to donate to you right now, where do they go?
Either Patreon or PayPal. PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod and Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire.
All right, Joanne, thanks so much, and please really support our work. We're gonna sit here and break down these narratives, and be sure to check out the links. I know at least in my show notes page, I'm sure in Joanne's too, we're expanding to new platforms. Even though what we talked about in today's show came right from Time Magazine, I'm not gonna be surprised if we get a little note on the video about election integrity and all of that. So the censorship is coming, so make sure you're checking out the new and different platforms. Anything else, Joanne?
That's it. Thanks so much, Kyle. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joanne.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Kyle Anzalone for doing the Swapcast. Follow Kyle on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone _. KYLEANZALONE_. Subscribe to the Conflicts of Interest podcast at the Libertarian Institute and on YouTube. This podcast is independent media, so listener support is really important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find the podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, on Patreon, and on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And watch out for some new platforms coming soon. Follow on Twitter @AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.